Welcome to Today's Walk with Dr. Roger Spradlin from Valley Baptist Church, the program helping you to understand the Bible today.
Welcome to Today's Walk. I am Kate Neighbors here with Pastor Roger Spradlin. We're getting farther into the book of Jonah.
We're finally in chapter 2, right?
Yes, we are.
It's a great story, though.
It is. Let's jump in and watch Praying in a Crisis, Part 1.
Open your Bibles with me now to the Old Testament book of Jonah, chapter 2. Last week, we looked in chapter 1 as Jonah was swallowed by this great fish that God had prepared. Some people have even translated that at times as a whale. We looked at what the Word of God says about that, but we also talked about the feasibility, scientifically, of a whale or a great fish being able to swallow a man whole. Now, I don't know if you saw the news this week. There was a story out of the Central Coast here in California at a place called Avila. There were two women kayaking, and a great humpback whale came up from underneath them and opened its mouth and completely engulfed their kayak and took it under the water. Now, it spit the kayak out pretty quickly, but it just was a reminder how huge these creatures are and how easy it would be for a whale or a great fish that God created to swallow a man whole. Now, that may be filed under useless information for you, but I'm saying it simply to think about the context of the very week that we are talking about Jonah being swallowed by a fish, that we have this illustration for us right off our own coast of a kayak being taken in the mouth of a whale. But either way, we're going to continue in Jonah chapter 2 in a message that I'm calling Praying in a Crisis. Now, let me take a moment just to kind of recap where we're at in the story of Jonah. Jonah was a prophet of Israel. God told him to go to the city of Nineveh to preach. Nineveh was the capital city of the Assyrian Empire. But there was a problem. Jonah hated the Assyrians. They were the avowed enemies of the tiny nation of Israel. In fact, we know that it was only 75 years or so later that the Assyrians invaded and conquered the country of Israel. Because he hated the Assyrians, Jonah just refused to go. Now, it's not that he misunderstood God. I don't know how God spoke to him, maybe by dream by night or a vision by day, but somehow God made his word and his will clear to Jonah. So Jonah clearly understood that he was to go to Nineveh, but he just refused to go. He didn't refuse to go out of fear. It's not that he thought, well, the Assyrians are the enemies of Israel, so if I go, they're going to capture me, they're going to imprison me, they're going to torture me, and then they're going to kill me. We find out later in the story that he really didn't want to go because he hated the Assyrians. He was prejudiced and really held racism in his heart against them. He thought, well, if I go to Nineveh and I preach about God's mercy and God's grace, they're going to listen, they're going to believe. And if they believe, God is going to forgive them. And he didn't want God to forgive them. He wanted God to destroy the Assyrians. So Jonah essentially ran in the opposite direction. God said, go east to Nineveh. And so he headed west to the Mediterranean and caught a ship, headed further west even. And God sends a storm, and this ship is caught in this great storm. And the sailors on board the ship, they think they're going to die. The storm was pretty intense. And they're not Hebrew sailors. They're not Jewish like Jonah. They're probably Phoenician. But they're crying out to their pagan gods and their idols. And they notice that Jonah isn't really praying. And so, in fact, he's asleep. And they wake him up and they find out that he's a prophet of Yahweh God, that he's a Hebrew, that he's running from God. I mean, he just tells them that. And he also tells them, listen, guys, if you throw me overboard, the storm is going to cease. So they're desperate. Eventually, they throw him overboard in an effort to save themselves, and the sea instantly becomes calm. Well, Jonah, he sinks in the water, and suddenly a fish that God has prepared swallowed him. The book of Jonah really isn't about the fish. The fish only makes a cameo appearance in this drama. The fish is not the star of the story, and even though it gets all the press, Jonah's not even the star of the story. The star of the story is God, and really the nature of God that we find something out about. There's some great theological themes in the book of Jonah. There is the sovereignty of God, that is, that God is in control. There is the compassion and the mercy of God. God extends mercy to the sailors, they survive. He extends mercy to Jonah, he survives in the belly of a fish. And I think he even, extends mercy to the fish, because the fish is able to spit Jonah up. He extends mercy eventually to the people of Nineveh. There's another great theme in the book of Jonah, and that is missions. Jonah is called by God to go to a people group that is not his, to declare to them the message of God. Now, Jonah is not written like some of the letters of Paul and others in the New Testament, where you have a paragraph or a pericope on the mercy of God, and then you have a whole chapter maybe on the sovereignty of God. Jonah is a narrative. It's a story. We extrapolate the themes and the truths from the story. Jonah is swallowed by fish, and not only does he survive inside the belly of the fish, which is amazing when you think about it. I'm really curious about that, and you probably are as well. Have you ever wondered what it was like for Jonah inside the fish? I mean, he's fully conscious and alive inside the fish. We know that because in chapter 2, verse 1, it says he prayed from the belly of the fish. So he's wide awake and conscious. What was that like? I mean, I know what a fish smells like on the outside, but I have no idea what they would smell like from the inside. Jonah is in absolute darkness. There's not even a glimmer of light. What would you do if you were in that circumstance? Put yourself in Jonah's place, inside the belly of the fish. What would you do? You'd probably look for a pocket knife, but if you didn't have one to cut your way out, what would you do? Well, Jonah did exactly what you would do. He did exactly what I would do. He prayed. I mean, that's what I would do, right? If I was swallowed by a fish, I can assure you I'd pray. I even know what I'd pray. It'd be a very short, it'd be a very focused prayer. Get me out. And my second prayer would be even more focused. Get me out now. Well, Jonah chapter 2 is a record of Jonah's prayer. The reason that we know what he prayed is I think that chapter 2, maybe the whole book, is autobiographical. It's Jonah writing about Jonah. Now, most biographies, sometimes even autobiographies, they have really catchy titles that tells you something about the person's life just from the title. I wish Jonah would have given us a title, don't you? I mean, there could have been some neat titles for this story, like Jaws, the inside story, or Making a Whale of a Mess of Your Life. But he doesn't give us a title. When you read the book of Jonah, it becomes obvious that chapter 2 is different in its structure and its style from chapter 1, chapter 3, and chapter 4. The book is a narrative, so chapter 1, 3, and 4 is written in prose in the third person, being about Jonah. But chapter 2 is not written in prose, it's poetry. And it's written in first person. It is Jonah speaking to God in first person in the second chapter. Now, when I say poetry, it's not like English poetry, which is all about meter and rhyme. It's Hebrew poetry, which is about parallelisms and chiastic structures. And I wish we had time to look at the structure of this poem. It's a beautifully structured poem. You say, wait a minute. You mean in the belly of the fish, this guy is composing poetry? What a guy. Well, I don't think that's how it happened. I think it was written, of course, in retrospect. He obviously did not write the book of Jonah in the belly of the fish. He wrote it when he got out. And in chapter 2, he's recalling how he felt. The emotion of those hours within the fish, and he's recalling what he prayed. And he puts it in this very emotional poetry. Obviously, Jonah's having a near-death experience. Scientists tell us that we can live about 40 days without food. Now, I can't personally verify that, but that's what they say. We can only live about 3 or 4 days without water. So Jonah's been 3 days without water. He's completely dehydrated. He's at the end of human endurance when he cries out to God. I don't know how long it took Jonah to begin to pray. Maybe as soon as he's swallowed by the fish, he begins to cry out to God. Maybe he's so stubborn, he didn't even pray on the first day. Maybe he didn't even pray on the second day. Maybe he waited till the third day before he prayed. We don't really know. But in some ways, Jonah's story is our story. Oh, ours is much less dramatic than Jonah's, but no less real. Jonah ran for God, and sometimes that's us. Oh, maybe we're not as defiant of Jonah. Maybe we don't willfully run like in the opposite direction. We don't come out of church one day, just shake our fist at God and say, I don't want anything to do with you anymore. Maybe ours isn't as so much running from God as it is drifting from God over a period of time. But our story is his story. His story is our story. God could have given up on Jonah. He could have said, hey, you wanted to be thrown into the sea? Because that's what Jonah said. Hey, throw me into the sea. That's what you said to the sailors, and they did it, so you made your bed, now lie in it. God could have just let him drown in the sea. But instead, God saved Jonah. He rescues him. I think he did so Jonah could have a new understanding of grace and mercy and the compassion of God. Jonah obviously has no compassion for the Ninevites. His thinking was, let them all go to hell. Let them all be destroyed. I don't care at all. He totally misunderstood the nature of God, that God is a God of love, of mercy, of grace, and even of forgiveness. But now, in the belly of the fish, it's Jonah in need of mercy. It's Jonah in need of grace. Sometimes we turn to God. We don't turn to God until we hit bottom. Have you noticed that? Now, you talk about hitting bottom. Jonah had really hit bottom. I don't know if he literally hit the bottom of the sea, but the fish took him down. For Jonah to turn back to God, it took a crisis. The reality is God often uses a crisis in our lives for us to recognize our spiritual needs. It's during tough times that we realize how desperately we really need God. God doesn't allow a crisis in our life to hurt us. Some people completely misunderstand the nature of God. They think that God's up in heaven. He's just throwing lightning bolts at us and he's letting bad things happen to see how we're going to respond. And they think of God as a bully, or they think of God like a little boy that puts a worm on a hot sidewalk just to watch it squirm. That's not God at all. God doesn't allow crisis in our life to hurt us. He sometimes allows crisis in our life to help us. It's in the difficulties of life that we tend to change our perspective. It's in the difficulties of life that we change our priorities and many times even our values. That's certainly true of Jonah. Look with me, beginning in verse 1 of Jonah 2. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from the belly of the fish's belly. And he said, I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. Sheol is the place of the dead. It's a synonym for the grave. So Jonah, he obviously thinks he's going to die. He hasn't read the book of Jonah, right? I mean, he doesn't know how all this is going to turn out. He's slowly being digested alive inside the fish. So he cries out from the belly of the fish. He says, from Sheol, as if from the grave, I cried out, and you heard my voice. You see, there are lessons that we can learn from a crisis. Here's the first principle. God often uses a crisis to drive us to pray. Jonah confesses that's why he prayed. All of this chapter is a prayer. And he says, the reason I prayed is because of my affliction. It's a big question in life. What would it take to make you pray? Oh, the pagan sailors in the midst of the storm, they prayed to their pagan gods. But they noticed that Jonah's not really praying. In the storm, he refused. Then they throw him overboard. And there's no record of him fighting or struggling. He just acquiesced to it. There's no record of him fighting as they pull him to the railing and they throw him into the sea. His heart is so hard, he doesn't even seem to care about his own life. But now, in the pitch blackness of the digestive tract of a fish, he prays in the crisis. It was centuries later that the Apostle Paul in the New Testament said, God desires that men everywhere should pray. I don't know about you, but I've prayed just about everywhere you can. I've prayed standing, I've prayed sitting, I've prayed kneeling, I've prayed prostrate laying on the floor, I prayed on a plane, I prayed in a car, I prayed on the mountaintop. But there's one place that no human being other than Jonah has ever prayed, and that was inside the belly of a fish. His prayer, though, recognizes the sovereignty of God, and it recognizes really the providence of God. Look with me in verse number 3. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your billows and your waves passed over me. Then I said, I've been cast out of your sight, yet I look again toward your holy temple. The temple was where God resided upon the earth. And he said, you, God, hauled me into the deep, into the sea. You say, whoa, wait a minute, Jonah. You've got it wrong. God didn't do this. The sailors, they're the ones that threw you overboard. Jonah now sees that God is in control. He says, it's your billows, it's your waves, it's your storm. The storm is no longer impersonal to Jonah. He sees God behind all the circumstances of his life. He's acknowledging the sovereignty and the providence of God. There was a time in the Old Testament where David, the great king, messed up. Actually, David messed up a lot of times. But there was one time where God told him, and he told him very clearly, I don't want you to count the people. You say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, Israel had many, many enemies, as well as David. And so David wanted to count the army in order to figure out how many soldiers he had, be able to strategize in battles and so forth. But God said, no, I don't want you to do that. I want you to just trust in me. Don't count the soldiers, just trust me. But David didn't really trust God. So he counted the soldiers in disobedience to God. A prophet came to David and said, David, you've messed up. God told you not to count the soldiers, but you did. You're not trusting in God. You're trusting in the might of your soldiers. So God is going to judge you. But it's giving you a choice of what that judgment will be. Behind door number 1 is 3 months of falling into the hands of your enemies. You'll be defeated in every battle for 3 months. Behind door number 2 is 3 days of pestilence. God is going to send a disease, and many people in Israel are going to die. What is your choice? And David essentially said, I choose door number 2. And here was his reasoning. I'd rather fall into the hands of God, who is merciful for 3 days, than to fall into the hands of my enemies, who are not merciful for 3 months. You see, even in judgment, God is in control. Even in judgment, he is merciful. We see that with Jonah. He totally messed up. But even in the chastisement of God and the judgment of God, there was mercy. Now, in verse number 4, Jonah tells us essentially that I feel distant from God. You have cast me from your sight. Really, Jonah wasn't separated from God. I think God was very much with him in the fish, but he felt that way. Remember, chapter 2 is all about emotion. Have you ever felt that way? As a believer, you prayed and you felt like your prayers didn't go any higher than your head. You felt like there's no one there even listening to me. Maybe you felt like a little kid at the bottom of the stairs and the Father's at the top of the stairs, and you cry out to the Father and He just turns the light on and leaves you in darkness, and you felt like that sometimes, that God just ignores you. That's the way Jonah felt. Verse number 5. The water surrounded me, even to my soul. The deep closed around me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. I went down to the moorings of the mountains. The earth was as bars closed behind me forever. Yet you brought me up. You brought up my life from the pit. Oh, Lord, my God. Jonah is sinking. This is a description before the fish. So evidently the fish didn't gobble him up right at the surface. He said, I'm sinking. There's seaweed that's wrapped all around my head, and I'm going to the bottom. I'm going down to the moorings of the mountains. The mountains on the central, or the coast of Israel, are similar to the mountains and the foothills of our central coast here in California. They rise up very quickly from the sea. And Jonah says, I'm going to see where the moorings are. I'm going to see the roots of the mountains where they begin, because I'm going to the bottom. I'm sinking, he says. And yet, then he says, oh God, you brought me up out of the pit. You say, wait a minute. Is he talking about the fish? Yes. The fish is what God used to rescue him. Now, when we read this story, we think that things went from bad to worse. There's a great storm, and that's bad. But then it got worse. Jonah's thrown into the sea. That's bad, but then it got worse. He's in the sea, and now he's swallowed by a fish. And the fish is worse. No. The fish is not worse. The fish was God's rescue plan. The bad thing was his disobedience. The bad thing was the storm. The bad thing was being thrown into the sea. The fish was a good thing. God created the fish. He prepared the fish to rescue Jonah and to give him transportation back to the shore. And Jonah acknowledges that. He's changed his mind. He was willing to die. He's told the sailors, just throw me overboard. But now as he's sinking in the water, his lungs are about to burst. He's sinking, wrapped in seaweed. And suddenly the fish swallows him. And inside the fish, there's air. It's probably very rancid, but it's air. And he's alive. And he said, God, you have rescued me. From the pit, you have saved me. He acknowledges that even this nasty, smelly fish was God's way of protecting him and rescuing him. Verse number 7. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer went up to you into your holy temple. He said, when my soul fainted. He's talking about when he was in the crisis, that he was just about to give up. He's at wit's end. That's when he turned to God. I wish we could learn without a crisis. But most of us as human beings, we're just not wired that way. Often in days of blessing, that's when we tend to forget God. It's in days of blessing that we focus on the gifts of God rather than the giver. But it's in days of adversity and crisis that we're often drawn back close to God. That's the way it was with Jonah. Jonah said, throw me overboard. He got what he wanted, but then he didn't want what he got. And sometimes that's us. Sometimes God allows us to make our bad decisions. He doesn't stop us. We have volition. He's given us a choice. But when we make our bad decisions, when we stand at the fork of the road and we choose wrong, it has consequences. The nation of Israel in the Old Testament, there was a time that they wandered in what is called the wilderness for many years, and God provided for them every day. I mean, if you've ever been to that part of the world in what was called the wilderness, it's like a moonscape. You realize that they couldn't survive without God's provision. So He gave them manna each day. And manna, we think, was kind of a bread-like substance. We're not sure. But they got tired of manna. They were eating manna in the morning, manna at noon, manna at supper time. And so they said, we don't want manna anymore. We don't want it. What we want is meat, they said to God. And God said, well, I'm providing for you. I'm giving you all that you really need. We don't want that anymore. We want meat. So God sent them quail. But there's a little phrase that said, God gave them meat, but sent leanness to their souls. Why is that? Because they were no longer trusting in God. And that's sometimes us. We want to walk away from God. We want to defy His word, rebel against His will. And God says, okay, you can do that. But there's going to be consequences of your bad choices. In the belly of the fish, Jonah turned to God.
That was another wonderful message from our series looking at the book of Jonah. Pastor Roger, Jonah chapter 2, it's poetry.
It really is, which seems unusual because it's also the record of Jonah's prayer that he prayed from inside the fish. So it's not like the guy's in the fish composing poetry. This was written later. And I think he put it in poetry rather than prose because it's the cry of his heart. The rest of it, the story, is just a narrative, him telling us the facts of what happened. But chapter 2 is Jonah's heart. And I think he felt the only way to really express that was in poetry. It's full of emotion as he cries out to God. And essentially, he cries out to God for forgiveness and mercy. And that's the prayer that God always hears. If we admit our sin, our failure, and we cry out to Him for His forgiveness.
Maybe you have been a Christian all your life. God hears your prayers. Maybe you just became a Christian. He hears your prayers. Maybe you are watching right now and you have questions. You haven't made that decision. You haven't cried out for forgiveness. I want you to stop what you're doing and pray. And then I want you to call the number at the bottom of the screen and talk to people about it. Ask them your questions. I know that there have been times in my life that I have had friends tell me, I am too heavy-hearted, I can't cry out myself. And I have prayed for them. And those people, when you call the number, are like that friend. They will help you cry out to the Lord in your time of need. Thank you so much for today's message. I know that I sometimes feel like I repeat myself, but I just am so encouraged by it. But I think that's the nature of the Word, right? The Bible is encouraging, and we love helping you understand your Bible today. So join us next week for part 2. This has been Today's Walk.
Today's Walk is the broadcast ministry of Valley Baptist Church. This program is supported directly by our church members and viewers like you. You'll find plenty of great resources when you call us or visit our website. Thank you for watching, and join us again next week for Today's Walk from Valley Baptist Church in Bakersfield, California.